All right, welcome to our lecture on Book 2 of Aristotle's Ethics. This is for, of course, our St. Vincent ethics class. It's just a very simple introduction to some ethical thought, particularly focusing on Aristotle, but definitely still reviewing some other ethical systems. Now, if I were to ask you, what was Book 2 about? There are some people, as I've already mentioned to you in former lectures that are listening to this particular lecture. But if I was in class, I've asked, what is Book 2 about? And different people have come up with different answers. And it's kind of a trick question. And it's kind of a trick question because Book 2 isn't about just a singular subject. So it is a bit of a trick question. We have to remember that the ethics doesn't come to us as if Aristotle were an author, and as an author, he's organizing very, very distinctly 10 different chapters. That's not exactly how the ethics comes to us. They are compilations of lecture notes, which are systematic. I'm not saying that Aristotle is not being systematic, because Aristotle is always systematic in some way, shape, or form. But that doesn't mean that each book is going to very discreetly cover a topic like the good, or happiness, or habits, capacities, etc., etc. Because in Book 1, really Book 1 is about the nature of the good and about what is meant by happiness, what are the limits of political and ethical study, questions like that. And as we've already studied, we can see that there's a relationship between those questions. We can see that there's a relationship between those subjects. And in a similar way, Book 2 is about some very key elements of Aristotle's ethical theory, namely, probably most namely, habit formation, a few other kinds of questions, the mean, habit formation and the mean, probably the two most important concepts in this particular chapter. So that's really what I want you to focus on. There are other satellite concepts that are quite important for you to understand. But if I would have to say which ones you should focus on, I would say, what are the nature of habits? What do they have to do with the virtuous life? And why does Aristotle talk about this notion of the mean? And what does that have to do with ethical behavior? The mean. And we'll go through this in the course of this lecture. Now, this lecture does match with some questions that I find important, but I doubt that many of you, or at least some of you, do not have those questions in front of you. I'm just going to go ahead and explain something as a general sketch of how Aristotle views how we form particular characteristics, okay? If you take a look at this, if I can move out of the way properly, over here we begin with a capacity or a power of the soul. This is a description of human nature. All of this kind of combined would be elements of human nature, okay? But our human nature, in order to manifest itself, in order for it to be seen, what our human nature is, we realize that as humans, we have particular abilities. We can, and I've written these on the board before. This is things like our ability to sense, the five senses. our ability to feel emotions, our ability to grow and reproduce at the very bottom level, right? And then sensation, then our ability to feel emotion, and then perhaps highest of all, our ability to think, our rationality. So those are capacities, abilities to do something. But those capacities have to be actualized. They have to actually do something. Otherwise, they remain dormant, right? I mean, if you have your eyes closed, well, the sense of sight is dormant. Then you have to engage in the act of seeing. Capacities always act. Otherwise, capacities are asleep, so to speak. And we're certainly not always thinking. In a way, we're always thinking, and in probably some more important ways, some of us should be thinking more than we do, but perhaps fail to do so. We have certain abilities to feel emotions. Sometimes those are quiet, sometimes those are active. And the mystery of human freedom, it's like, how do we get from here to here? What determines how we actualize particular capacities? Well, that's precisely the mystery of human freedom. That's really a somewhat unanswerable question, because the way that you actualize we all share, everyone listening to this lecture, we all share very similar capacities, or no, actually not similar, the same. They're the same capacities. We may have, our capacities might be slightly different in, in their shape, so to speak. We might have sharper sight than someone else. We might actually have a higher IQ than someone else. So our capacities can change, but we can actualize those capacities, and we all share that. But when we act in a particular way over and over again, when we act a particular way with regularity, those activities form what we might, certain complexes called habits. Habits, regular ways of performing activities, regular and predictable ways of forming activities are habits. And we can understand that just through common sense. We still use this word very, very similarly as Aristotle did, if not precisely the same. I need my coffee. So, Aristotle even quotes like men become builders by building houses. Men and women become harpers by playing harp, and in the same. So we might have a capacity to do different capacities to do some of those activities. We perform those activities over and over again, and then a habit is performed that makes it possible really to do that activity either well or badly. See, that's a very key distinction to Aristotle. Remember, Aristotle is a very objective thinker. He does assume a great amount of, he assumes a certain culture, which to a certain extent we still share with him. That there are certain behaviors that are simply laudable, and there are some behaviors that are base. And there is an objective standard to, although difficult to find, Aristotle is going to admit that in multiple places in the Ethics, that although this standard of what is the difference between good habits and bad habits, or virtues and vices, although difficult to find, still possible. Whereas some other thinkers would not so much admit that. Certainly Nietzsche wouldn't quite admit this as readily as Aristotle, although there is a kind of standard in Nietzsche about true nobility versus the herd mentality, and about a kind of noble creativity versus a base or slavish sort of resentful attitude. So there is still an ethics that exists with Nietzsche, but it's not nearly as objective as Aristotle wants to get at. So capacities, those are powers. We perform certain acts. I mean, say you're trying to learn to play the guitar. I mean, Aristotle uses harp, but he didn't have guitars in his day. The harp was the guitar of his day. But we don't know how to. I always think it's kind of amusing when someone says, "Well, you know, I'm teaching myself how to play the guitar," and I'm like, "Well, do you know how to play it?" They're like, "Well, no. Then you're a bad teacher." It's kind of an interesting. I know that it's possible for us to teach ourselves, but I'm just being a little silly there. At one particular point, we might be playing the guitar, and so it's an act. We're actualizing certain capacities that we have. But has that become habit yet? No. Now, if we were to do it, and there are some studies that indicate that if you perform a particular activity with regularity, I think somewhere around 21 or so times. I've seen that figure before. I couldn't necessarily attest to that. But if we perform if we were to say practice the guitar 3 weeks in a row, let's take that as truth. Then we may have formed a habit. There are certain regularity forms, not only really in the soul, Aristotle would claim, but now we know through scientific research that neurological pathways are created by habitual behavior. This is a fact. This is not just interesting philosophy that we're reading that's 2,400 years old. But now we can map electrical activity in the brain that indicates certain habitual complexes. And it would be fascinating to study that a little bit more. I don't have the time to go into it. But once those habitual complexes are formed, then these result in particular characteristics that we have. In other words, and Aristotle he defines characteristics actually in a couple of different ways. Really in relation to particular virtues and in relation to particular emotions, depending on what our activities have been. And of course, therefore, depending on what habits we form because of the activities we do, then that disposes us. We could even put maybe dispositions. It disposes us to act in particular ways towards particular emotions and virtues, doesn't it? That all makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, if every time you commit, or if you did something brave, you know, if you're a child and, you know, you ran out to the playground and tried, like, you know, you went onto the monkey bars and you're actually very tiny and you're praised consistently for sort of out of the box, brave behavior. Well, that's going to have an effect on you as a child. You're probably going to develop, certainly a habit for courage. Let's call it courage. And your disposition or your characteristic regarding the virtue of courage is going to look differently than, say, every time you approach that playground, your mother screams bloody murder and doesn't allow you to go near it because she doesn't want you to hurt yourself. Now, we've all seen both of those behaviors, right? And I'm not even saying that either one of them is necessarily right or wrong. I think that they could be right or wrong depending on the circumstances involved, okay? But do you see, what I just want you to see is a general map of this logic. Do you at least see that, those that are here present? I mean, do you have any comment on that? Is something unclear? Because if it's unclear to you, it's probably going to be unclear to everyone else listening. We're good so far? Okay. All right. So that is, to understand some of that in a general way is necessary to understand book 2, okay? I'm trying to kind of give you a schema or map to make the reading more understandable. I got to take my vitamins. Hold on. Oh boy. Now, as for that, talking about habit formation, there's been numerous tests that have been done. Things like, and I don't know what the instruments are called. A certain instrument, placed on the head to measure electrical activity. And there was some experiments done where things like, I think this was in Finland or Denmark, that Danish was played backwards to the people who knew the Danish language, okay? And their entire brain lit up. Like they could see it, like it was strange, it was new, okay? So it was lighting up the entire cranial or cerebral activity. As they heard it more and more, or as they even looked at a piece of paper and could start reading Danish backwards, less and less regions of the mind began to light up, okay? And they could actually learn to read Danish backwards. And then just a tiny little piece of their brain was lighting up, okay? And I think this is, and they did these kinds of experiments with numerous things like that, with the same result, that if something new was introduced, there was a great deal of electrical activity that happened in the brain. And as a particular activity repeated over and over, less and less of the brain was needed. Oh, the PC in here is apparently rebooting on its own. So sorry about that. Be quiet. So the point that I wanted to make is once something becomes a habit, even biochemically speaking, it's almost as if the brain learns to put itself on autopilot. Okay, that only a smaller piece of the brain is needed to understand that activity because certain neural pathways have been created by that habitual activity. I mean, if you think about some of the amazingly complex habits that we can form, I mean, we've probably all seen things like this. I just saw an internet video of it was a little child. It might have been 5, 6 years old, playing some Bach concertos, symphonies, okay, just immensely complex music from memory, okay? Just that child wasn't thinking about every single note that he was playing. That wouldn't be possible, right? that a habit has performed, or a habit has formed to such a degree that his parts of his mind have been placed on autopilot. I think that, of course, Aristotle doesn't put it that way. I'm putting it that way. But I think that it's language that we can understand in our technological age. Okay. And that happens to a soul. Think about that for a second. That certain impressions are made in the soul, whereby we can form not only one kind of habits, because there's two kinds. There are moral, and they're also intellectual. In other words, we can form habits of the way we do things, habits of acting, but also habits of thinking. Very, very important point to understand. Because I guarantee you, your habits of thinking, the way that you interpret the world, is going to directly affect how you act towards that world. I mean, won't it? I think we can readily see that this is the case. I'll just give you an example, and I think that you should understand this. I'll step back for a little bit more. I'm going to erase this because I need to draw a few more things. But hopefully you understand this. Capacity is to act, that habits form as stable complexes of acting regularly. And then characteristics form towards certain virtues and emotions based on those habits, okay? And habits can be of two kinds, namely intellectual and moral, okay? So, say goodbye to that. I'll just give you an example that I've come up with, or that I've seen in my ministry. I've been a priest for almost 20 years now. It's hard to believe. But say that you're dealing with, let's say, a woman who's dealt with very significant abuse in her life, okay? And growing up, say that her father, unfortunately, was a terrible father. And say she also had an uncle that was more or less equally terrible. And her first boyfriend, more or less based on the awful examples that her father and her uncle gave her, he was also awful, okay? So here she has this idea of let's see, masculinity or manhood in general. And because of her experience, for which we cannot blame her because this is simply what she's experienced, she relates the idea of masculinity to, let's just call it abusive. That these two are absolutely linked in her mind. So she's in here. These two ideas are linked. Whenever she thinks of abusive, she thinks of men. When she thinks of men, she thinks of abusive. That idea is ironclad in her mind. And we need to, of course, logically ask the question, are these two ideas necessarily linked? Of course they're not. Hopefully we've all experienced men in our lives that have been life-giving and nurturing and kind. I know certainly I have. But we can't blame her, really. We can't. There's no blame here. This is what she's experienced. But if she is to have any hope of meeting the world with, say, fully open eyes with the full prospect of actually separating these two and experiencing finally men as something that would be as individuals that would be kind or loving towards her. She needs to go through a process of, she doesn't need to, hopefully she will go through it. She needs to go through a process of separating these two ideas. What I'm trying to say is that this is an intellectual habit. Do we think for a second that the way that she's connected these two ideas will not then also affect her moral habits? Okay. Particularly towards men, but it's also going to affect her habits towards women, right? Because then, because she experiences men as abusive, she's going to rely all the more on women and almost kind of place an emphasis on those relationships that perhaps she shouldn't, because she's almost like putting too much weight on a shelf that can't bear that weight. But do you see how, I just want you to see how this might play out. It's a terribly simplistic example that's incredibly complex. So hopefully you understand. I realize I'm dealing, and it's a sensitive issue. But it's a real issue, which is why I bring it up. It's an issue that I've seen. It's an issue that I've attempted to really try to think about. And like, what's going on here? So that I might try to help this young woman just have a more open and free life. And noticing that there are some of these complexes of ideas that are linked together that perhaps should be pulled apart. Okay. Now, in the same way, you know, there are certain ideas that should go together. I mean, say we have the idea of college, and let's say the idea of study. These two should go together, but I've met a few students who don't seem to get this idea yet. They seem to think that, I don't know what their high school was like, but perhaps they were actually so intelligent, and this does sometimes happen. They were so intelligent that they could coast along in high school, and then they find when they get to college, oh boy, okay, this is a more intense game. This is more intense. They can't quite come to college with those same habits. So new habits need to be formed. This needs to go in there, the S for study. And that needs to form more moral habits that are superior to the former habits. Now, why am I justified in saying superior? That would be a very good question to answer, wouldn't it? And I think that it can be answered. Superior moral habits, because you might say, well, who's to say? I mean, well, aren't we free to just be dumb and lazy and whatever, play computer games all day and just do what we can to get through life? Absolutely. This is not a question of political freedom. If that's how you want to live your life, knock yourself out. Okay, that's great. Okay, but if you want to argue with me that you will have as much utility, to those around you, if you want to argue that you will make just as much of a contribution to society, which I think is a superior thing, that you will, make the money that you would if you were industrious, that you might meet the mate that you would like. I'd say you're crazy if you think that those two ways of looking at the world are equal. No, they're not. Okay. I'm talking about something pragmatic here. This has practical truth. Because if you are industrious, if you work hard, this is just how life works. You tend to create more relationships, which increases your chances of actually meeting a mate that's more superior, even in your eyes. Okay, you certainly increase your skill level, which increases your ability to make money. It increases your social standing. I mean, we could just go down the list. I don't think it's arguable that one is objectively superior to the other. Now, again, if that's the way you want to live your life, I think that you should be free to live that way. That would get us into a political discussion a little bit more than an ethical discussion, right? Which is an important distinction to make. I think as long as you're not a burden on society, I mean, if you want, now I would argue if you think that other people should pay for the fact that you just want to play video games all day and smoke weed, and that you should darn well have that right and that other people should pay for that, now I would argue against that. And I think that there would be very effective political arguments that could be made there. And how ethical would that be? I mean, that's an ethical question right there, isn't it? That if you're an able-bodied person, should you not, in our society, because we are very, very societal, gregarious creatures, you should have, unless you're crippled, of course, in some way, shape, or form, which certainly happens, you should contribute to that society. Now, if you can't, well, I do think that we have an obligation to care for you, because that's humane, that is charitable, that we would hope to be cared for ourselves, I think, if we were completely incapacitated. And if that's the case for me, then I think I could make an ethical case that I should extend that to someone else if they were terribly incapacitated. But I wanted to mention just that point about how ideas might get linked together to form intellectual habits. That would definitely change our moral behavior, right? Very, very important point. Another important point, and I do want to look at this again. There was a fellow that asked a question about this in class today that I couldn't completely answer the way I want, but I will look it up. Do you know there's another name for habit? They're almost synonymous. And I do think that Aristotle does coin this phrase. And I think that this is going to make lots of things make sense. Second nature. Ever heard that phrase? It's like, you know what? I did it so much, it became second nature to me. Ever heard that? I think that's still a fairly common phrase. Mary, have you ever heard that phrase? You have? Okay. Mary is the young lady in our audience. How old are you, Mary? How old are you?
13.
13. Okay. See? That's great. We do not discriminate for age in this class. If you can take it, then take it. I don't care if you're 8 years old. You want to understand this? It's awesome. So this phrase is still used, and isn't it a great phrase or translation of habit? Habit. This is what we're talking about. Can we change our human nature? Okay, yeah. People, I'm online, right? Some people, no, we cannot change our human nature. We can't. We can't change our basic programming. Uh, there are, no, that opens a can of worms. There are some modern philosophers and scientists that will argue. I think it's only fair for me to mention this as a philosopher. Some would not agree with that statement. That no, actually, human nature is malleable, it's changeable, and the sky's the limit. Um, let's stop the conversation at least this point. Aristotle certainly didn't think that that was true. Thomas Aquinas certainly doesn't think that that's true. A number of modern philosophers do not think that that's true. They still hold with a certain substantialist or objective way of looking at things. But that is an arguable point. It's at least fair to mention that. But we can't change our human nature, which is we're just given it. But we can superimpose second natures on it that make it look quite different. I mean, our habits are so important, y'all. Jeez. And I know that sounded super Southern the way I just said that. But I was born in the South. God bless her. Okay. Our habits will change the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we act. They will. There's so much modern science behind this. I know to a certain extent this is common sense, but what I'm trying to get you to see, or what I'm trying to give you some of the ethical terminology that gets us a little bit beyond mere common sense when talking about these ethical issues, so that when we face our very, very complicated world, we can speak about ethical issues with a little bit more of an intellectual capacity than just he said, she said, or I think, you think, and I think you're stupid or you're wrong. But why? I don't know. Okay. Unfortunately, that forms a lot of our arguments. So I'm trying to get you to think a little deeper than that. Aristotle is certainly going to help us do that. Second natures. And of course, these second natures can end up being, W for wicked, V for victory. I mean, V for virtuous, okay? Wicked and virtuous. I know have you heard of, what's that? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Hopefully this makes some sense to you. I mean, what I'm trying to do, if it's not completely clear, is connect a 2,400-year-old text to some things that we still talk about and understand and know today. This is very relevant for today's discussion. And the modern science that's proving this, it's not as if it's new. This is 2,400 years old. I can't stand it when some philosophers or scientists, guess what we discovered? We discovered something called habits, and they exist actually in our neuronal activity in the mind. Thank you. Thank you, Einstein. Okay, Aristotle sort of figured some of that out. I know I'm being a little snotty, but that's my style, okay? That's just my disposition. I formed a habit to be snotty, and so there you go. I just try not to go too far with it. Sometimes I do. When we go to therapy, if we go to therapy, isn't that a beautiful way to start a sentence? When we go to therapy, because we're all just, out of, let's say, the three things in the soul, and Aristotle wouldn't really disagree with this fundamentally. Emotions, thoughts, and acts. Acts are not really exactly in the soul, but that's arguable. When we go to therapy, or if we go to our friend, we've had a terrible day, just good old-fashioned therapy is usually just going to a friend, right? Going to a spouse. Which one of these three are we really looking to have changed? Think about that for a second. If this is somewhat arguable, but generally speaking, it's this. Okay, it's emotions. We feel bad, and we want that stopped. We want it to end. Okay. The problem with that is emotions. Well, let me ask another question before that. Which one of these three do you think is the easiest to change? And the answer to that, I'll just give it to you. And this is, again, if you look up cognitive behavioral therapy, these are some of the assumptions of cognitive behavioral therapy, which do, some of them harken back to Aristotle. That's why I'm bringing them up. And some of these concepts that Aristotle talked about in book 2 are related to cognitive, what's the phrase? Cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, there we go. Out of the three, this one is the easiest to change. We can do a little thought experiment. Okay, on the count of 3, I want everyone to feel joy. 1, 2, 3, do it. Mary, do you feel joy? It's not working, is it? Your face does not look horrifically joyful right now. Well, at least you're smiling, okay? But we realize that's not possible we can't just wave a magic wand and feel better. If we could, psychologists would be out of a job, wouldn't they? Some priests would be as well, okay? And if that weren't true, we also wouldn't have any addictions, probably, or at least their number would be greatly reduced. Because what is an addiction? An addiction is an effort to directly and immediately change this. I want it changed, and I want it changed now. That's really, and it's far more complex. Please, and you already know I'm throwing out massive strings of generalizations, okay? But I'm just trying to give you a schema to think about book 2. That's really all I'm trying to do, okay? It's easiest to change this. So what cognitive behavioral therapy seeks to do, which Aristotle, I'm convinced, would absolutely agree with, because I think some of his assumptions, I think cognitive behavioral therapy is full of Aristotelian assumptions, okay? That we have to decide we're going to change a particular activity, or really more effectively to change a habit. So we do certain repetitive acts, a very key one, especially if we're feeling, say, depressed, down. Very key thing to change is a regular schedule. I mean, if you go to therapy and you're feeling melancholic and they don't tell you that you need to try to live a balanced and stable schedule, I don't know if you're seeing a very good therapist, unless you have some very special circumstances, which you may, that could be altering that. There's tons of science on this, that if we get into a habit of that activity, like wake up at 6 a.m. every morning, launch into my day, become more industrious, form a habit after doing this, like let's say those 21 times. I don't know if that's totally accurate, but let's say it is. We form that habit and it works for us. All of a sudden, you know what? We find that our mood has lifted a little bit. We find that we're getting more work done. We're finding actually that we have a little bit more time to spend with our friends, which is paying off dividends for relationships. People are actually talking to me a little bit more. Imagine that, okay? I'm not quite as lonely as I was before. Maybe just a little, but incremental change is, well, incremental change over time adds up to be a mountain, okay? So our thought about this changes. Hey, you know what? This seems to be working. The ideas in our mind, which are more malleable, or they're not as malleable as emotions, but our thoughts start to change. And following those thoughts, we start to feel better. That's kind of a basic summary of what cognitive behavioral therapy does. It tries to get us to act differently, test those habits, see if they work, start changing some of your thoughts about maybe who you are, what you're capable of, what the world is all about. Start changing some of those thoughts, which will in turn change those emotions. So you might not need some of those addictions that you're going to quite as readily or quite as quickly, because you're doing it more the old-fashioned way. This is a harder way of doing it than going for an addiction. Certainly is, okay? But the problem with an addiction is, well, we all know that. And in the long run, they end up wrecking. They wreck our health. They wreck our life of thought. They wreck our emotional life. They stop working. That's simply what addictions do. They stop working after a time. So we need a better, more long-term solution, one that's more in accordance with our nature. This is just our nature. It's our nature. There's a reason why cognitive behavioral therapy works. There's a reason why there's stacks of books on how addictions work with the human being. It's because we have a particular nature and we respond to these things in very specific, predictable ways. And if we did not have a nature, we would not respond to those things in very specific and predictable ways. It's a very strong argument for human nature, really. So again, I wanted to connect that, this particularly cognitive behavioral therapy, because I do think that many of its assumptions are Aristotelian, even if they don't necessarily say that. I'd have to look at the literature a little bit better. But when I was looking at book 2 and thinking about CBT, I was like, you know what? There's a lot of Aristotelian assumptions here. This is fascinating, and I think relevant. You know, relevant. We're not just we're hopefully not just reading this some odd 2,300-year-old text as I don't want this to be a museum piece. This is not a museum piece. Dead things are in museums. Okay, this is not dead. I want to show this as something very alive. I don't like philosophy that's dead. If it's dead, then it probably should be dead. And let's hold a funeral for it because it's not working anymore. Okay, but this isn't. And so I'm trying to show some relationships between some of the things that we've learned in the book and even like some modern psychology, right? Psychology if we haven't forgotten what that term means, is knowledge of the soul. Psyche, suke in Greek means the soul. Logos means knowledge or science. So you put psychologos, psychology. That word means knowledge of the soul. And I think that one massive problem, and there's a number of psychologists that would agree with me on this, is that psychology, some dimensions of psychology have forgotten that they're supposed to be ministering to human souls. And they've kind of erased that assumption. And that's a very huge assumption to erase. There's a particular, what is the name of that psychologist? Oh, I'm drawing a blank. Wait, stop for a second. Could you stop? Okay, I just wanted to stop and gather my thoughts for a moment. That psychologist that I was thinking about, his name is over here, James Hillman. He actually wrote, it was a very fascinating book. At one point, I believe it was a bestseller. It was called The Soul's Code, where he, one of his big kind of, I guess, pet peeves as a psychologist is he did believe that many of his colleagues were losing sight of the fact that psychologists were supposed to be caring for souls, that there's something very mysterious about the human person, and that every person is born with a certain very special capacity that he called the acorn theory, that you know, the whole tree is found in that acorn. You know, it's DNA, so to speak. You know, the entire tree, its entire life is contained in that acorn. That's biologically true. But he compares that with a human soul, that every soul that comes into the world has a certain code, has a certain mapping. And that really the project of our life is to try to discover what that is. And so if you find that idea interesting, he's a psychologist that you may find interesting. But I've related to this point about philosophy being useful. This was even a review question that I asked my class. I realized that some people listening may not even be in the class. But on page 40, Aristotle refers really to precisely this little tirade that I just made in his own language. But he said, and this is found in book 2, the very end of chapter 4. Yet most men do not perform such acts, but by taking refuge in argument, they think that they are engaged in philosophy and that they will become good in this way. In so doing, they act like sick men who listen attentively to what the doctor says, but fail to do any of the things that he prescribes. That kind of philosophical activity will not bring health to the soul any more than this sort of treatment will produce a healthy body. Now, what is he saying there? He's like, real philosophy isn't just reading this book and pretending you're nice and smart because you read it. That's not philosophy to Aristotle. This is very indicative of particularly the ancient Greek mindset. True wisdom is examining what is a life worth living, what are the ideas, and then putting it into practice. If you fail to put it into practice, you are not a real philosopher, you are a fake. You are a sophist. You are not a philosopher. And you have failed the test of wisdom. So Aristotle would very much agree. So would Plato, so would Socrates. That entire tradition is based on that idea. This isn't just a head trip. if we really come to some awareness about, you know what, I think that this certain thing is true. Like I need to form some better habits. That seems to be true. Well, then you need to do it. You need to examine what those might be for you, for your particular circumstances, and put it into practice. And so I wanted to legitimate my tiny little sermon on the meaning of philosophy and it being practical. It's not just me. It's not just my pet peeves. It's coming straight from book 2 of Aristotle, okay? Hopefully you understand that. Now, to finish, these are very, very important concepts that we have to understand or we fail to understand book 2. Aristotle talks a good bit about pleasure and pain, particularly in the first couple of books of the Nicomachean Ethics. And his basic point is that our pleasures and our pains operate as certain indices of whether we are wicked or whether we are virtuous. He makes and I think that this quote should clarify what he's saying. What he's saying is actually quite complicated, but men and women must be brought up from childhood to feel pleasure and pain at the proper things. That's a pretty sweeping statement, isn't it? It also has a lot of what? That crazy word, assumptions. Remember, we talked about that. That sentence has a lot of assumptions that from childhood, boys and girls, men and women need to be brought up to feel pleasure and pain at the proper things. The whole rest of the book is kind of Aristotle's way of telling us, well, what are the proper things? When he goes through the lists of virtues, he's explaining to us in longhand what he means by proper things. We still do in our culture share many very similar assumptions that Aristotle would have. You know, certain ways of acting in public, you know, certain rules of family life, certain ways of simply, you know, treating one another with kindness and respect, respecting contracts, not telling lies, you know, giving back when you borrow something. Some basic assumptions that we would still share, you know, in Western culture, and it would be actually quite similar in Eastern culture as well. But he throws that statement out and then just moves on. But I think that we can see how this works. Let's say we're talking about, and I like to use, and I used in class, this particular example because I just find it's amusing, but it's also true that I have 3 brothers, and my dad was pretty particular about us being very disciplined in church, okay? If my brothers or my dad ever happen to hear this lecture, I'm sure that they might be amused. Let's hope that they'll be amused. But if I moved too much my head to the left or to the right, my dad was going to reach over and he was going to squeeze my knee, okay, causing a great deal of pain. I don't know if my father was like a ninja in a past life or something. He found a nerve in my knee that would light up my entire nervous system. I don't exactly know how he did that, but it was very skilled and very effective. Now, he is habituating me and my brothers. That's pain, right? This is associated with a certain kind of behavior. I think what he was trying to teach us we could argue about exactly what he was trying to teach us. Was it reverence? Was it simply being disciplined in public, maybe? That's possibly arguable. But he's habituating us to feel pain at a certain kind of behavior. Okay, do you see how that works? So, I mean, people were they would go up to my mother and be like, your boys are so well behaved in church. That's because we were terrified, okay? But fear is not always necessarily a bad thing. Okay? Hopefully we can grow into something more mature and greater, okay, rather than mere fear. But every activity that we do is usually praised or blamed, or we experience pleasure or pain in association with that particular activity. And we can see that ends up forming particular virtues and vices. Okay, that's why Aristotle talks a lot about, look, we need in education, rewards and blame, pain, pleasure, they need to be used in the proper way regarding the proper virtues or vices. That's why he's talking about pleasure and pain. Do you see that point, at least? So it's about the training, the formation of these habits. Let's go back to that playground. If every single time I approach that playground, let's say I have that my mother, maybe she actually lost a child to an accident. I mean, she may be really not blamable for some of her behavior. So she's very, very particular about what her child is doing. And so when the child runs to the playground, she gets fussed at. The poor girl gets fussed at for kind of being really courageous, just being a child, being open. She wants to hit those monkey bars, man. But she has a mother that's like, no, that's bad. Okay, that's blame. That starts to form certain habits of mind and behavior. Absolutely. That's what Aristotle is trying to say. So and there are millions and millions of variables to this and examples that we could come up with. What I simply want you to understand is, why is Aristotle bringing up pleasure and pain in relationship to virtues? It's all about the education of the virtues. That's the point I want you to understand, okay? That's the point I think Aristotle wants you to understand. So the mean, if we fail to understand this concept, we fail to understand the rest of the book. So very, very important concept to understand. At this point, Aristotle brings up a kind of mathematical diagram or image. It's like in a line with two discrete points. It's that we can block off a certain region which is equidistant from both points, which we call the mean. But we understand that from geometry, right? That just makes sense. All he's saying is that it seems to be, generally speaking, when we talk about virtuous or virtue and vice, the virtuous action occurs in the region of the mean. That virtuous behavior is really is behavior between two extremes. Possibly a better way of looking at it. And those extremes are, of course, deficiency and excess. And for several pages in book 2, Aristotle gives us multiple examples that hopefully we can understand. But, just to bring up one, and probably one of the more classical examples, say he's talking about courage. That the virtue, the middle way, is called courage. And sometimes he's like, it's kind of hard to find names for these. Aristotle grants that point. He says that a couple of times in book 2, that finding even the right names for what we're talking about is not always an easy thing. Okay. Remember, Aristotle tells us, again, several times, we're not doing mathematics, we're doing ethics. And so there's going to be some wiggle room. I'm sorry, Chelsea. I can't just throw the answers out onto the desk and say, here they are. I would love to, but it's not the way it works. At the mean, let's call that courage. The excess, if we have too much, too much like zeal, a certain zeal within us, could be called like foolhardiness. You're a little crazy. When we're using an ancient Greek example, some fellow, if he has a sword and he's charging 10 men who are armed with spears, and the guy has no armor, is that courage, or is that being stupid, like foolhardiness? Aristotle is going to say, unless there aren't other mitigating circumstances, such as we could think of something like, well, maybe he just wants to distract them so that maybe his family can escape. And he's throwing away his life so that his family can escape. Well, I've just added a circumstance that actually makes that more understandable. Aristotle would probably call that a noble action, not a foolhardy one. But without that special circumstance, that seems rather foolhardy. He's got too much courage. He could also simply be cowardly. That he's called into battle and another fella is facing him, and he just simply won't face him, just turns and runs, fails to do his duty, fails to defend his country, fails to defend his family. That would be cowardice, a deficiency. Okay. And virtuous action seems to be in the mean. And when he defines this, just so that we understand how nuanced and how complex this is. I forget exactly what page this is on, but it is in book 2. Thus we can experience fear, confidence, desire, anger, and pity. He's talking specifically about the emotions here. And generally, any kind of pleasure and pain, either too much or too little, and in either case, not properly. But to experience all of this at the right time, towards the right objects, towards the right people, for the right reason, and in the right manner, that is the median and the best course. That is the mark of virtue. I'm quoting Aristotle. That's Aristotle, not me. So do you see that's very nuanced. It's very complicated, like to feel every emotion in exactly when we're supposed to, in the right way, towards the right people, for the right reason, towards the right objects, at the right time. Okay. Whew. That's rough. Okay. But Aristotle is trying to paint for us a picture. That is our ideal. And if we fail to understand this notion of virtue as occurring in that little range, there used to be an ancient anecdote that, we're trying to navigate a course between Scylla and Charybdis. I don't know if you've ever heard that term, but I could be wrong about this. I think Scylla and Charybdis were either something like sea monsters, or they could have been maybe like incredibly dangerous reefs or something. Or maybe one of them was a reef and one of them was a monster. It was something like that. Okay, I'll have to look it up now because I don't know for sure. And to go through this particular strait, a ship had to just go through this narrow pass, or he would be destroyed by Scylla or Charybdis. Okay? If one of you want to look up what the reference is while I'm talking, that would be fine, so that I can get it straight. But that is kind of how Aristotle views virtue, that it's not always terribly easy. As a matter of fact, it's often quite difficult. And he says this. This is on page 38. In both a virtue and art, they're always concerned with what is harder, for success is better when it is hard to achieve. It's an interesting way of putting it. But and we might at first go, why? Why? Well, when something is hard, don't we value it more? I mean, if something is just handed to us constantly or regularly, we tend to take it for granted. That can make us quite spoiled. But when we live a life training ourselves to be virtuous and hardworking, Aristotle is going to want to claim that there's a contentment, there's a happiness that arises from the nobility of learning how to navigate this mean throughout life. Okay? And finally, a point that's very important for us to understand is that ultimately, because I think that, and I have gotten this complaint before, I think I've made this complaint before, this sounds too darn hard. Why would I want to ever attempt it? Okay. Well, I started to explain that with just what I mentioned, that the effort produces a kind of contentment. I mean, if you have ever truly gotten in shape, if you've ever truly purified your diet and exercised regularly, which is really hard to do, okay? It's hard to achieve that. You start to feel good. There's a certain vitality and a certain contentment that produces that really can't be gotten in any other way. But it's difficult to get there. But we very much appreciate it. It's hard. But another point to remember before we close is, and I've used this image this example in class, that ultimately the virtuous man or woman, they don't grit their teeth to do virtuous activity. This is very, very important to understand. Because you could have two people walk through this door and sit in this classroom, say we have a discussion. One of them may be being kind to me because say they just dislike me, because they have to, because I'm giving them a grade, okay? And the other one may be being kind to me because they're simply a kind person. They've been habituated to be kind. Their activity, the way that it looks to me, might be absolutely identical. But one of them is truly, they're both virtuous in the sense that their activity is the same. Their activity is virtuous. But only one of them has achieved the ideal to Aristotle. that one of them is kind, but enjoys being kind. It's no longer painful. I mean, take another example. I mean, something like, say, two individuals, they were both addicted to something like porn, very common problem nowadays. And say they both get off, they get off of that. They go through a period of healing and support, and they're living purely, chastely, however we want to put it. Their behavior may be exactly the same, but one of them is kind of what we call white knuckling it. They're kind of grasping onto the chair so hard that his knuckles are turning white. He really doesn't like it, but he is being chased. But his buddy next to him, actually, he's like, you know what? I don't like looking at women the way that I used to. It's not pleasure. I enjoy being pure. I enjoy having more energy to put into thinking about just holier, more artistic or beautiful things. Which one has achieved the ideal? They're both externally identical, but internally, something very, very different is going on. The truly virtuous man or woman has habituated himself or herself to feel pleasure at doing virtuous activities which occur in the mean. And with that, I will close. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.